February 19th, 1945, dawn breaks over the black sands of Iwo Jima. The first waves crash against volcanic shores with a sound like distant thunder. Sulfur hangs in the air, thick, acrid, mixing with salt spray and the metallic tang of anticipation. 5,000 vessels stretch across the Pacific horizon, their gray hulls cutting through morning mist. On the decks of landing craft, United States Marines check their rifles one final time, their breath visible in the cold air, their faces young and hardened simultaneously. They do not yet know that the island before them, a misshapen piece of volcanic rock barely 8 square miles in size, will become synonymous with a kind of violence that defies comprehension. They know only what they have been told. Take the island, secure the airfields, save the bomber crews who have been falling into the Pacific with nowhere to land between the Marianas and Tokyo. Above them, Mount Suribachi rises like a broken tooth against the lightening sky, silent and waiting. In underground bunkers carved deep beneath the island's surface, Japanese commanders stand in chambers that smell of earth and concrete and the sweat of men who have not seen daylight in months. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi reads a letter he has written to his wife but will never send. His hand is steady. Around him, officers review positions they have inspected 1,000 times, pillboxes interconnected by 11 miles of tunnels, gun emplacements with interlocking fields of fire, ammunition stores buried so deep that American naval bombardment has barely scratched them. They have transformed this sulphurous wasteland into what they call an unsinkable fortress, a place where Japanese defensive doctrine would reach its most terrible perfection. Kuribayashi has told his men they will not conduct the traditional banzai charges, will not waste themselves in glorious futility. They will kill 10 Americans for every Japanese life spent. They will make the cost so unbearable that even America's industrial might will falter before it. They will prove that Japanese spirit, properly channeled, properly fortified, can still turn the tide of a war that every rational calculation says they have already lost. This is the story of what happened when that certainty met American reality. This is the story of what Japanese commanders said when the Unassailable was seized, when their perfect calculations shattered against something they had not accounted for. Not superior firepower alone, though that came in quantities that beggar description, but something more fundamental about the nation they had awakened and the men it sent to this volcanic hell. The Pacific War, by the winter of 1945, had become a calculus of blood and distance. For 3.5 years, American forces had been climbing a ladder of islands across the Pacific, each rung purchased at terrible cost. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan. Each name represented lessons written in the bodies of young men who learned that Japanese soldiers would fight with a ferocity that American military doctrine had no framework to comprehend. The kamikazes had begun their death flights. The concept of surrender had effectively ceased to exist on the Japanese side. American planners looked at casualty projections for an invasion of the Japanese home islands and saw numbers that would make the entire European theater look like prologue, estimates ranging from 500,000 to over 1 million American casualties. General Douglas MacArthur pushed for a Philippines first strategy. Admiral Chester Nimitz argued for a direct thrust across the Central Pacific. Between them, they were drawing lines across maps that would determine who lived and who died, which families would receive folded flags and which would see their sons return. Iwo Jima sat precisely at the intersection of necessity and nightmare. The island had no strategic value in itself, no resources, no ports, no native population beyond a few hundred civilians who had been evacuated, but it had 3 airstrips. B-29 superfortresses flying bombing raids against Japanese industrial centers were making 14-hour round trips from the Marianas, crossing vast stretches of ocean with no emergency landing options. Damaged bombers ditched in the Pacific by the dozens. Crews died of exposure in life rafts or drowned in the darkness waiting for rescue that often never came. With Iwo Jima in American hands, the B-29s would have a halfway house, a place where damaged aircraft could land, where fighter escorts could refuel, where the tightening noose around Japan's throat could be drawn inexorably tighter. The Joint Chiefs of Staff designated it Operation Detachment. The intelligence estimates predicted the island would fall in 5 days. The Marine Corps committed 3 divisions, nearly 80,000 men, to ensure those 5 days would not stretch into something worse. What neither the planners in Washington nor the strategists in Pearl Harbor fully grasped was that Iwo Jima represented something unprecedented in the Pacific War. This would not be another island where Japanese forces held the beaches and defenders could be flanked or bypassed. Kuribayashi had studied American tactics. He had lived in the United States, had traveled from coast to coast, had seen the factories and the highways, and understood with grim clarity exactly what his nation was fighting. He had written to his superiors that traditional Japanese defensive doctrine, holding the beaches, conducting glorious charges, dying with honor in the first days, was tactical suicide against an enemy with total naval supremacy and unlimited ammunition. Instead, he would turn Iwo Jima into a labyrinth. Every cave, every bunker, every tunnel would be a strong point that had to be reduced with flamethrowers and grenades and the bodies of young men crawling forward through volcanic ash. He would give the Americans their island 1 bloody yard at a time, and by the time they raised their flag on the summit of Suribachi, they would have paid a price that would haunt their military planning for generations. The pre-invasion bombardment began 74 days before the landing. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment pounded the island with a ferocity unprecedented in the Pacific theater, more tons of ordnance per square mile than had fallen on any other piece of real estate in history up to that point. The volcanic rock shook. Flames erupted from fuel stores. Above ground, the devastation appeared total. But beneath the surface, in those miles of interconnected tunnels, Japanese soldiers waited in the darkness with their rifles and their mortars and their carefully calculated fields of fire. They listened to the earth shake above them and trusted in their general's vision. They had been told they would inflict such casualties that American public opinion would crack. They had been told that here, on this sulfurous rock, Japanese spirit would demonstrate its superiority over American material abundance. They believed it because the alternative, that they would die in a cave on a worthless island for a lost cause, was unthinkable. The Marines who came ashore that February morning expected the bombardment to have done its work. They had seen the reconnaissance photographs, the cratered landscape, the apparent absence of defensive positions. The landing itself went too smoothly. The first waves hit the beach and struggled up terraces of volcanic ash that gave way beneath their boots like sand, like trying to run uphill through loose gravel, exhausting within minutes. Still, the Japanese held fire. More Marines poured ashore. Tanks, artillery, supplies. The beach became crowded with men and machinery, and then Kuribayashi gave the order. The island exploded into fire. Artillery shells fell in patterns so precise they seemed to be walking up the beach, detonating with mathematical accuracy among the clustered Marines and their equipment. Machine gun fire came from positions that were invisible, from bunkers whose firing slits were barely wider than a hand, from caves whose entrances had been camouflaged so expertly that men could walk past them at arm's length without noticing. Mortars rained down with a steady drumbeat of detonations, each burst sending fragments of volcanic rock and steel through flesh and bone. The Marines went to ground, pressed themselves into whatever cover they could find on a beach where cover barely existed, and began the process of learning that this island would not be taken according to any timetable, that the intelligence estimates were fantasy, that they had landed in a killing ground designed by a genius of defensive warfare. Within hours, the optimistic projections began to dissolve. Within days, casualty figures were exceeding worst-case scenarios. A Marine Corps photographer named Joe Rosenthal, scrambling up the slopes of Suribachi on the 4th day of fighting, would capture an image of 6 men raising the American flag on the summit, an image that would become the most reproduced photograph in history, a symbol of American determination and victory. What that photograph did not show was that 3 of those 6 men would be dead within days. What it did not show was that taking that mountain was only the beginning, that 30 days of fighting still stretched ahead, that the real killing grounds lay in the central highlands and the northern plateau where visibility measured in yards and death came from angles that defied anticipation. Japanese commanders, observing this from their command bunkers, allowed themselves moments of grim satisfaction. The Americans were dying at rates that matched projections. Their advance was measured in yards per day rather than the miles that had characterized earlier island campaigns. Radio communications intercepted by Japanese intelligence officers spoke of exhaustion, of fear, of units bled white and still being committed to the line. Here was the proof that defensive depth, properly engineered, properly manned, could stall even American industrial might. Here was the validation of Kuribayashi's vision. But what they did not account for, what no Japanese military planner in that entire war truly internalized, was that the Americans would pay the price and keep coming, that they would feed division after division into the meat grinder and never flinch from the calculus, that they would bring up flamethrower teams who would advance on bunkers with a casualty rate that approached certainty, burning Japanese soldiers alive in their caves and moving to the next position before the screaming stopped, that they would call in naval gunfire and aerial bombardment with a precision that turned entire hillsides into moonscapes, and when that failed to dislodge defenders, they would send Marines forward with satchel charges and grenades to do the work face to face. That behind every casualty stood a replacement who had been training in California or North Carolina, who was already loading onto transport ships, who would step into the line without pause because the American industrial and manpower base could absorb losses that would have broken any other nation on Earth. By the end of the first week, the illusion of victory through attrition had begun to crack in the minds of Japanese officers. In a tunnel complex beneath Hill 382, a position American forces would come to call the meat grinder, a Japanese captain named Samaji Inuye wrote in his diary that the Americans fought with a mechanical quality that was both impressive and terrifying. They did not charge in banzai waves that could be mowed down and counted. They advanced behind artillery barrages of such density that the volcanic rock itself seemed to liquefy. They used tanks as mobile pillboxes, bringing flame and high explosives to positions that had taken months to fortify. When one Marine fell, another took his place. When a tank was knocked out, two more appeared. The Americans, Inuye wrote, fought as if they had an infinite supply of everything: men, ammunition, fuel, time. It was not courage in the Japanese sense, not a willingness to die for honor. It was something more disturbing, a confidence born of certainty that material superiority would inevitably prevail, that no amount of Japanese spirit could overcome the simple mathematics of American abundance. This was the symbolic truth that recurred throughout the battle, the one element that Japanese commanders returned to again and again in their communications and journals: abundance. American Marines carried rations that included chocolate and cigarettes. They had medical corpsmen who moved through fire to reach wounded men, who administered morphine and plasma and evacuated casualties to hospital ships equipped with surgical theaters that rivaled civilian hospitals. They rotated units off the line for rest periods measured in days rather than months. They received mail from home with a regularity that seemed fantastical. Letters from wives and mothers, newspapers, packages containing luxuries that Japanese soldiers had not seen since before the war began. Japanese defenders subsisted on rice and whatever supplies had been cached before the invasion. Their wounded died in the tunnels because evacuation was impossible. Their medical supplies had been calculated for a garrison, not for the attrition rates of this prolonged siege. And yet they were told that their spirit, their willingness to die, would somehow compensate for this material imbalance. It did not compensate. It could not compensate. And in the dark honesty of command bunkers, as the American advance ground forward yard by yard, Japanese officers began to articulate a truth that contradicted everything their military culture had taught them. Colonel Tadashi Takaishi, commander of the 145th Infantry Regiment, sent a report to Kuribayashi's headquarters on the 14th day of battle. The Americans, he wrote, had reduced his defensive positions through a combination of flamethrowers and demolitions that was methodical to the point of industrial. They would identify a cave or bunker, suppress it with small arms fire, advance a flamethrower team under covering fire, pour burning fuel into the opening until everything inside was ash, then move to the next position. They did this with a rhythm that suggested practice, training, institutional knowledge refined through previous campaigns. Japanese defenders who attempted to retreat through connecting tunnels found the exits blocked by Marines who had already infiltrated the network. Takaishi's conclusion was stark. The Americans had created a system for killing fortified defenders that was as much engineering as warfare, and Japanese defensive doctrine had no answer for it. Similar reports filtered up the chain of command. Major Yoshitaka Hori, stationed on the neighboring island of Chichijima and monitoring communications from Iwo Jima, recorded radio transmissions that evolved from confident tactical updates to terse casualty reports to final messages that had the quality of epitaphs. One company commander transmitted that his position was surrounded, that American Marines were reducing his bunkers one by one, that he had no expectation of survival or reinforcement, but wanted it known that his men had fought with honor. Then silence. The American advance moved forward. On tactical maps, Japanese-held territory shrank like a puddle evaporating in sunlight. Kuribayashi himself, that genius of defensive warfare who had planned this battle to the last detail, began sending communications that carried undertones of recognition. To Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, he reported that the Americans had committed resources on a scale that exceeded all projections, that their willingness to accept casualties had not wavered despite losses that would constitute a strategic defeat for Japan. To his subordinate commanders, he sent orders that grew increasingly simple. Hold your position, kill as many as possible, die in place. The elaborate defensive network he had constructed was being systematically dismantled by an enemy who treated American lives as valuable, but not so valuable that they would not be spent to achieve an objective. This was a calculus Japanese military planning had not anticipated. They had expected American democracy, with its free press and its public opinion, to be the weak point, that civilian pressure would force political leaders to halt campaigns that cost too many lives. They had not counted on a democracy that had fully mobilized for total war, that had decided the cost of victory was acceptable regardless of the price. By the battle's third week, the symbolism of abundance had evolved into something more psychologically destructive. Marines advancing through the northern plateau found Japanese dead who had been starving. Defenders who emerged from caves to surrender, an almost unprecedented act in the Pacific War, spoke of having no water, no food, no ammunition. They had been told they would fight to the death. They had been given the means to do so. But Kuribayashi's prediction that they would hold for months had not accounted for the speed with which American forces could reduce prepared positions when they were willing to pay the butcher's bill. The tunnels that were supposed to be sanctuaries became tombs. The interconnected defensive network became a trap when Marines learned to use explosives to seal tunnel entrances, entombing defenders alive. The carefully hoarded ammunition ran low and then ran out because resupply was impossible once the Americans controlled the island's perimeter. In a bunker complex beneath the central highlands, a Japanese lieutenant named Musashino, no first name survives in the records, wrote a final entry in his journal that was recovered months later by occupation forces. He described watching American fighter planes land on the partially completed airfield while fighting still raged in the north. The aircraft, he wrote, were so numerous they seemed to circle like gulls. They landed, refueled, rearmed, and took off again to provide close air support to Marines still clearing Japanese positions. The airfield they had been ordered to defend to the last man was already operational, already serving the purpose for which the Americans had spent so much blood to take it. The entire defensive strategy had been predicated on denying the enemy that airfield long enough to make the cost unacceptable. Instead, Marines had taken it while the battle still raged, had engineers repairing the runway while Japanese artillery still fell on the southern beaches. Musashino wrote that this was the moment he understood they had never had a chance, not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the Americans could afford to take casualties that would cripple Japan while simultaneously repairing infrastructure and expanding operations. They were fighting a different kind of war, one where the battle and the occupation and the exploitation of victory all happened simultaneously, where the industrial base was so vast that losses on Iwo Jima were being replaced even as they occurred. This was the transformation in perception that American material superiority inflicted on Japanese military thought. Kuribayashi had predicted his forces would kill 10 Americans for every Japanese lost, and they very nearly achieved that in some sectors. But it did not matter. The Americans absorbed the casualties, adapted their tactics, and continued the advance. They lost 26,000 Marines killed and wounded out of the 70,000 committed. They lost a higher percentage of casualties in 36 days of fighting than in any other Pacific campaign, and they kept coming. The final collapse came not in a dramatic assault, but in a slow constriction. American forces compressed the remaining Japanese defenders into an ever-shrinking pocket in the island's northern tip. Artillery fire fell 24 hours a day. Flamethrower teams moved through the remaining cave complexes with a thoroughness that bordered on exterminatory. Japanese soldiers with no ammunition conducted bayonet charges that were cut down by machine gun fire before they closed half the distance. Others sealed themselves into caves and detonated grenades rather than face capture. Kuribayashi himself died somewhere in those final days. His body was never identified, his death never confirmed, except by absence. The general who had planned to make Iwo Jima America's bloodiest lesson simply vanished into the volcanic rock and the ash. On March 26, 1945, 36 days after the first Marines hit the beach, the island was declared secure. The declaration was premature. Japanese holdouts would continue to emerge from caves for months, even years after the war's end. But the organized defense had been broken. American control was absolute. Engineers expanded the airfields. Bombers began using them to reach mainland Japan. The strategic objective had been achieved. The cost had been exactly what American planners had been willing to pay, nothing more, nothing less. In Tokyo, Imperial headquarters reviewed casualty reports from Iwo Jima with a silence that spoke louder than any communique. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers who had defended the island, fewer than 300 had been taken prisoner. The rest were dead, buried in the tunnels they had constructed, immolated in bunkers that became crematoriums, or simply gone, vaporized by the tonnage of explosives that had fallen on 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Kuribayashi's defensive masterpiece had inflicted unprecedented casualties on American forces and had changed precisely nothing about the war's trajectory. The Americans had the island. The bombers were flying. The noose was tightening. What Japanese commanders said in those aftermath weeks, in debriefings, in reports, in private journals that would be captured later, carried a tone that was part admiration, part horror, part recognition of a truth their military culture had spent decades denying. They spoke of American tactical flexibility, of the speed with which Marine units adapted to defensive innovations that should have stalled them for weeks. They spoke of the close air support, the naval gunfire, the flamethrowers and demolitions employed, with a proficiency that suggested not just training, but institutional memory spanning multiple campaigns. They spoke of the sheer material weight of the American offensive, the sense that behind every destroyed tank was a factory producing 2 more, that behind every fallen Marine was a training camp graduating his replacement. But most of all, they spoke of the psychological impact of facing an enemy who would not be deterred by casualties. Japanese military doctrine had been built on the assumption that spirit could trump material, that willingness to die conveyed a battlefield advantage that the soft democracies could not match. Iwo Jima shattered that assumption against the reality of a democracy that had mobilized for total war, that had decided the price of victory was acceptable, that would send its young men into volcanic hell and keep sending them until the objective was achieved. The Americans, Japanese officers reported with something approaching awe, fought as if they believed their system, their democracy, their industry, their culture, was worth dying for. And they did it with a logistical efficiency that turned warfare into a kind of terrible arithmetic where Japanese spirit was simply a variable to be calculated and overcome. This was the unassailable truth that the seizure of Iwo Jima revealed, that abundance properly mobilized is its own form of power, that a nation which can afford to lose 26,000 casualties taking a worthless volcanic rock because that rock serves a strategic purpose is a nation against which attrition warfare is suicide. The Japanese high command had gambled that American democracy would be the weak point, that public opinion would fracture under the weight of casualties, that material superiority would mean nothing if the will to use it faltered. They had not accounted for a democracy that had fully committed to total war, that would spend whatever was necessary to achieve unconditional surrender, that viewed each loss as tragic but acceptable in pursuit of a victory that was never in doubt. The flag that went up on Mount Suribachi became one of the defining images of American military history. But the real story was written in the tunnels and the ash fields and the casualty reports that documented what it cost to place that flag. It was written in the journals of Japanese officers who watched their perfect defensive calculations disintegrate against an enemy who would not be calculated, who absorbed losses that should have been decisive and treated them as merely expensive. It was written in the transformation of Iwo Jima from fortress to airbase, from strategic objective to operational reality, all while men still died in the caves below. In the war's final months, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Okinawa and ultimately Japan itself, the lesson of Iwo Jima echoed through Japanese military planning. Every fortress island, every defensive position, every calculation of how many American casualties would be required to force negotiation, all of it had to be recalibrated against the reality that the Americans would pay whatever price was asked and then name their own terms. The kamikazes intensified. The plans for defending the home islands grew increasingly desperate, calling for civilian militia armed with bamboo spears to resist American landings. But underlying all of it was the recognition that they were fighting an enemy whose material abundance had become a weapon as decisive as any battleship, whose democratic system had mobilized resources on a scale that made Japanese industrial capacity look like handicraft. The war would end not with an invasion but with atomic fire, a demonstration of technological abundance so overwhelming that even the most fanatical defenders could not rationalize continued resistance. But the psychological groundwork was laid on islands like Iwo Jima, where Japanese commanders learned that their unassailable fortresses were only unassailable until America decided the price of taking them was acceptable. Where spirit and steel met abundance and arithmetic, and spirit lost. The black sands of Iwo Jima, turned volcanic glass by flamethrowers, scattered with the debris of two nations' military hardware, mark the place where this lesson was written in blood and fire. The island stands today as a memorial, restricted, largely uninhabited, a place where the ghosts of two armies contest ground that matters only for what it represents. It represents the calculus of total war, the price democracies will pay when the alternative is submission, the terrible truth that freedom's defense sometimes requires a prodigality with life that seems to contradict the very values being defended. What Japanese commanders said when America seized their unassailable island was this: that they had miscalculated not American strength, but American will, that they had confused democracy with weakness, that they had bet their nation's future on the assumption that a people who valued individual liberty would not spend those individuals in their thousands for strategic abstractions. They said it in reports and journals and radio transmissions that grew more desperate as the battle progressed. They said it in the silence that followed, when the guns finally stopped and the volcanic rock stood scarred and American-held and operational. And in that silence, if you stood on those black sands and listened, you could hear the larger truth echoing across the Pacific, that abundance, married to purpose, is a force that cannot be outlasted, that democracies at war become machines of terrible efficiency, that the very openness and prosperity that authoritarian regimes mistake for decadence can be transformed into a weapon that breaks fortresses and ideologies alike. The island remains. The lessons endure, and the cost, calculated in the bodies of young men from Iowa and Texas and California and Tokyo and Osaka and Kyoto, stands as testament to what happens when certainty meets reality and finds itself wanting. This is what the Japanese commanders learned. This is what Iwo Jima taught. This is the price paid to prove that some things, some islands, some principles, some visions of how the world should be ordered, are not unassailable, no matter how perfect the calculations when an aroused democracy decides they must fall.